Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is another nail-biting, spine-tingling tale by the fantastically talented Michael Lockhart. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR. If you haven't subscribed to the DMT Forest of Fear channel, what are you waiting for and where have you been? Smash that subscribe button and why not throat punch the notification bell to stay up to date with all DMT posts. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Origins of Dogman. Let's get straight into that. By the light of the silvery moon, I want to croon to my honey about who loves whom. Honey moon, keep shining in June. Your silvery beams will bring us dreams of my lovely in June. By the silvery moon. I finished the old tune and stared down lovingly into Lacy's wide brown eyes. She gave me a big smile and wiggled in delight. We both enjoyed the early summer evening on the front porch, indeed, by the light of the silvery moon. I stroked her back and cuddled her close. In so short of a time, she'd become a true delight in my life. Dogs have a way of doing that. Oh, you thought she was a woman or a girl? Well, that's okay. So did she. Her life had been hard up to the point when the folks at the local animal shelter had ended up with her. She was a medium to large mixed breed. Plenty of golden retriever in that mix by the look of her, and trending towards the larger end of the scale. A little russet in the coat and a slightly pointy nose, and maybe some Irish setter. She was still young enough to be a little fuzzball, but was starting to look like a real dog. A grown-up. Okay, an adolescent. She had plenty of energy and was clearly very bright. It hadn't taken long to house train her, and she could always sit and stay. And she was kind enough to tolerate me singing old songs as we pottered around my place and wasted time. The life of the newly retired. I loved animals but hadn't wanted any when I retired. I felt like I would be travelling or working on projects and wouldn't have time to properly care for one. And then I stopped by the shelter to visit and oogle Miss Wanda Jameson. We'd met elsewhere, but she told me where she worked and invited me to visit. The next thing I knew, I had Lacy and a complete setup for a new pup. And Wanda trundled me out to my truck without so much as a "buy your leave, here's my number," or "kiss my foot." Women. But my Lacy was loyal. A scratch on the rump just above the tail and another behind the ears, and she was mine for the day. Okay, at least for the moment. Pooches sometimes have short memories. I hadn't realized until Lacy arrived and I had to start sharing my home with another living being just how lonely I had become. Sure, I had my fun with the old gals around town, but I hadn't looked at any of them seriously. My wife had died many years previously. We had no children, and without her, well, life could be empty at times. She was still the other half of my internal dialogue, and now I had a sweet little lady to take on walks. One who wouldn't fuss at me or argue when I griped about politics, and one who liked me singing old songs as much as my Rhonda had. Life with Lacy was good. That moon sure was bright. It was full. Gibbous, folks used to say. Bright enough that I decided that we could take a walk through the yard, let my little critter relax and enjoy the great outdoors before we headed inside for bed. Lacy sniffed and gabbled over and rooted her nose under every bush and tree with the tirelessness of youth. I envied her for a moment, and then she started getting close to the woods near the edge of the property. We had paper company-owned forests on two sides, and they extended for miles. I never knew what might be lurking under those branches. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. I didn't want my girl to encounter a copperhead or other nasty concealed in the moon shadows. And I called to her, "Lacy, come back over here. Good girl. Come on." Naturally, she decided that she didn't want to be a good girl, or maybe she was just too excited by the things she smelled. and so she kept at it for a moment, and then abruptly halted in her tracks. She looked up and out into the forest and gave a little huff, not a bark, just a startled defensive sound. She stared for another moment, and then bolted forward into the trees. "Lacy!" I called in vain. "Get back here!" I was suddenly afraid. What if she'd taken off after a coyote or wild dog or, worse yet, a feral hog? Those things were dangerous to full-grown dogs. Lacy was still a pup. I hadn't planned on the walk, so I didn't have a flashlight or walking stick and had nothing on my feet but flip-flops, but I ran after her, heedless of what was sure to happen to my feet on the rough forest floor. And then I heard a yelp. The sound was engulfed by a deep-throated growl, and not Lacy's. It was a yelp of pain and fear as she wasn't too far ahead. I heard the sound of rustling brush as some large animal or person fled from that same direction. Far more noise than little Lacy could produce. I found her, lying between the roots of an old oak tree, her fur stained with blood, her ribs pumped with heavy breaths, and a slight whimper and whine emanated from her throat. Something large had bitten her along the scruff of her neck and had maybe shaken her. It had to be large. She was nearly 40 pounds. It may even have been a cougar. I was nervous, but otherwise I set aside my major fears and scooped up my little girl and carried her back home. As I hobbled through the last of the trees before my yard, I was startled by the sound of a low octave howl that rang out through the woods. The challenge of a predator, triumphant over a fresh kill. Maybe Miss Lacy had interfered in a hunt. In any case, some poor creature had just met its end. I got her inside the house and under some clear lighting and examined her. Her wounds did not appear to be deep or near anything vital, but they were already swollen, and I could see irritation around each puncture. She'd gone limp and nearly lifeless, her breathing now slow, like she was in a deep sleep. I wrapped her in a towel and carried her out to the car. I drove her several miles into town and to the veterinarian's office. She lived behind the clinic, and I knew that she would take on an emergency case. In our area, those were sick livestock as often as household pets. And poor Dr. Stone had just gone to bed, but she gamely answered the knocks and rings. She escorted Lacy and me to the clinic, and once we were inside, she immediately went to work on a now decidedly limp dog. She shooed me out into the front area and ordered me to make some coffee, since I'd made her get out of bed. I complied and allowed her to do her work. When I looked back in on them, she was putting in some stitches and wore a worried frown. That made me worry. It was a long night. The next morning, I was awakened from where I stretched out on the sofa in the waiting area by Lacy nosing at me. When I was mostly alert, she gave me her usual, effluviant dog smile. I could not understand how such a sweet creature managed to have such hideous breath, and despite my relief and sheer joy, it took me a few minutes to sit up and get my joints to move properly. Well, as properly as they did these days. And there she was, perky and goofy as ever, wagging her butt in counter to her towel. A few fragrant face licks got me fully alert and on my feet. Ugh, gross. I grouched playfully as she attempted to wave away the foul smell. When Doc arrived, I settled a bill with her and thanked her profusely. She seemed surprised that Lacy appeared to be doing so well. I must admit, I was worried for her last night. I expected to have her here for a few days, but the punctures look, well, significantly healed, far more than they should be. She's had her shots, but you'll need to keep an eye on her. No interaction with other animals. She's quarantined for potential rabies exposure. Just a precaution, but please, watch her. Oh, and give her these twice per day. Antibiotics. Don't want her getting any nasty infections. As she said the last, she gave Lacy a quick back rub and was rewarded with a wet dog kiss. Phew, we need to get her in for a teeth clean. She's too young to have such awful breath, Dr. Stone exclaimed. And so we packed up and headed back to our shanty in the woods. I stopped by the little grocery store in town on the way back and picked up some treats for both Lacy and me, and we had a long night. When we arrived, Lacy hopped out of the truck through the driver's side as usual, too anxious to wait for me to open her side. Yet once she bounded into the yard, she stopped. She tensed and then cowered. Next thing I knew, she was glued to my side. She stayed that way until we got inside, and she'd cast nervous glances at the woods as we proceeded across the yard. She definitely remembered what had happened inside those trees. That evening, I gave her the antibiotic pill just before her supper dish. She took it fine and allowed me to inspect her wounds. I was astonished. They'd healed and left 4 perfect pink puncture scars, as though they were a couple of weeks old. I rubbed the area and she didn't seem to feel any pain. She just grinned at me and puffed a foul breath my way. We'd definitely have to visit the doc again for that teeth cleaning. I decided to wait until tomorrow to call for an appointment. I was glad that the wounds were better, but it was weird, and I thought it'd be best to keep the doc in the loop. I called Dr. Stone's office, and she had an opening in the next hour, and so I got ready and escorted Lacy back to the truck. She kept eyeing those trees warily and stayed on my leg. She stopped to have a pee, and she'd been holding it for a while. Apparently, she no longer wished to enter that yard alone. We'd have to fix that. I couldn't run outside to pee every time she did. Well, if my prostate kept growing, maybe. "Wow, Miss Lacy, you seem to be a miracle healer. Is that your true breed?" Miriam Stone spoke engagingly to my pup, who responded with a huff of breath and a goofy grin. "Oh, we need to clean those teeth ASAP. I have an opening for that Thursday afternoon. Can you bring her in?" She glanced over her shoulder at me. I nodded. Sure, Doc. Just let me check my appointment book." I mimicked flipping through pages and running down the lines of an imaginary book. Looks like we're clear. I'm retired, and Lacy hasn't decided what she wants to be when she grows up. She's currently in homeschool. Lacy perked up a little when she heard her name. Over the next few days, Lacy seemed to get much stronger and even filled out some. Doggy growth spurt, apparently, I thought as I watched her sniff around the yard after she did her business. She was still nervous about going far from the house by herself, but she was starting to recover her confidence. I was sure that she'd soon be racing around her territory once more. Her teeth cleaning had been pretty routine. Her breath still reeked, though. The stinkometer readings were much lower. Some dogs, they just have nasty breath, like some people. I noted that she preferred the side of the house farthest from the forest of late, and she'd occasionally stop, peek around the corner of the house and sniff the air from the direction of the shadows cast by the great boles and limbs. And she was doing that as I watched her, and then came an ear-splitting howl from inside the line, where the shadows were deep and obscured the exact source of the sound. Lacy immediately cowered and then bolted towards the back door of the house. She burst through her doggy door before I could even rise to my feet. There was still some light this evening, and after my rapidly beating pulse settled, I followed her into the house. It was time to check out what creature was lurking out there, haunting my home and my one true friend. I went inside and found my poor dog on the couch, burrowed beneath her favourite blanket, shivering with fear rather than cold. I patted where the lump of her back rose slightly under the material, and she growled and snapped at me. Fortunately, her head was covered, and so she didn't make contact. I drew back my hand, startled, and then realized just how scared she was. I'd frightened her. I walked over to the hall closet and picked up my 12 gauge. I checked the load and walked back out onto the back porch. I stepped off and headed in a direction from which I'd heard the howl. I intended to put a stop to whatever beast was hiding out there, menacing my home and frightening my little girl. This time I wore boots and I was ready to traipse through the brush. I was well armed and my blood was up enough to stave off any pain from my back and knees, and that constant pain from which Lacy distracted me so well. Now it faded into the background and I was on the hunt. I slowed once I got through the brush and under the trees, and I began to walk quietly, placing the balls of my feet before me. I stopped frequently to listen. There were no sounds. It was eerie. No birds, no rustles, not even a buzzing of insects. I took a whiff when a slight breeze blew through the branches. I retched and bent forward, prepared to give up my lunch. The stench was horribly foul. Death, rot, musk and something less definable but similar to a street person who hasn't been able to wash for a few weeks, all combined with wet dog. When I'd recovered from the initial shock of the wretched stench, I looked up towards the source of the odour, and through the leaves and branches of the yupon, I saw eyes. Red eyes. Not reflective but glowing with the inner light of a nighttime predator. They were set higher off the ground than mine, definitely higher than any normal animal. I thought, maybe it's a person in a costume or using a prop to play some prank. Yet I could not shake an overwhelming sense of dread. The features were sharp, a long nose that descended from between the luminous eyes. Heavy brows of fur around the eyes like a cap or long messy hair. I strained my eyes to look more closely, and yet the rest of my body was stood frozen in place. The figure shifted slightly as it read my thoughts, that I wanted, no, I needed a better look. The head lowered, and I saw that it had pointed ears that protruded from either side of its head and swept backwards. And then I saw the mouth, the maw of that monster. It gaped open to display sharply tipped teeth and fangs that seemed to wear a wicked grin, full of malevolence. I shook with fear, but eventually recalled that I held the shotgun. I blinked away my locked, tunneled gaze and raised my stock to my shoulder. As I tucked the butt into my shoulder in the pocket, I saw that there was nothing ahead of me, nothing hiding beyond the yupon. It had gotten even darker while the creature and I had stood eyeing one another in challenge and fear respectively. I heard some rustles out in the woods, the smell dissipated, the sounds of other creatures returned as though they had been muted, and then the audio had been switched on again. I backed a few steps, then turned and quickly made my way back to my yard, to the safety of my property, and to my Lacy. As I left behind the last of the trees, I saw that more time had passed than I had realized. It was nearing full-on dark. I felt the need to get into the shelter of my house, and so I picked up the pace again, my knees screaming at the effort. As I reached the porch, the howl bellowed forth once more just inside the line of trees. The vomit-inducing stench assailed my olfactory senses once more. I scrambled inside, and there was Lacy. She faced the now closed door and her best friend, who leaned back against it as though it could stop that thing outside. She lowered her head and growled fiercely, not at all like anything I'd ever heard from her. I soon realized that she did not growl at me, but at whatever was treading on the floorboards of my porch. I stepped away from the door and faced the front windows, all the while shifting the barrel between them, trying to follow the tread of an obvious heavy animal, person, being. I had no idea, but was adamantly sure that I didn't want to know. The screech of razor talons scratching the wood on the front door sounded, and Lacy let out a bark. The sound caused me to flinch, and against all of my years of practice in keeping my finger off of the trigger until I was ready to fire, I fired. The boom startled me even more than a bark as the butt of the 12-gauge slammed into my shoulder, and my ears instantly filled and began to ring. The stench of cordite rose from the chamber, and the end of the barrel, for a brief instant, overrode the foulness of the monster as I instinctively used my grip on the forestock to eject the first round and shove it forward to load the next. The first round had been buckshot, and now I had a nice fat hole just above and to the left of the doorknob, where I'd been hovering the barrel. And there was a scream of agony and surprise from the front porch, a deep, coarse sound that hinted on rage-filled pain. Lacy growled and barked, and I could just hear her as my poor damaged ears continued to ring. When did I take off the safety? My mind wandered. The question was irrelevant, but under pressure, the mind wanders in many directions at once. As all of these events occurred almost at once, my perceptions were somewhat overwhelmed. Before I had a chance to sort through all of the rubbish of my synapses, the door burst inward, shards of wood and spalls of glass flying haphazardly towards us. I stumbled backwards, and all but fell as the huge, fur and hair-covered monstrosity raged into my home in a snarling fit of rage. I pulled up the muzzle of the shotgun and tucked my face into the crook of my elbow to protect my eyes. And before I could recover enough to get the barrel back online, the beast was upon me. It swatted aside the barrel and its claws raked my arm, and then it raised its other hand to shred me. Before the frighteningly swift beast could strike again, a reddish-blonde streak shoved past my left shoulder and slammed into the thing's chest. Lacy! Yet, it couldn't be Lacy. This animal was much larger and more muscular. The front legs had elongated and the paws had morphed into clawed hands. The larger home invader gripped Lacy and flung her across the room. She impacted the wall farthest from the front door and slumped onto the floor. I was instantly furious and pulled the buttstock into the center of my chest and fired my next round into the monster. Boom! Just below the throat. Its response barely registered as I pumped in another round and fired, and then another, and then the fifth and the final round. These 4 had been rifled slugs. The bipedal big bad werewolf lay sprawled backwards on the floor, its upper body resting on my favourite rocking chair and bleeding on an afghan my wife had knitted for me. Bastard! Lacy was on it in a moment. Apparently she recovered from the stunning wall slam almost immediately. She had the thing supine and was dragging it across the floor towards the front door, her jaws clamped on the top of its right shoulder at the neck and her head working side to side. When she realized that it was no longer alive, she released it. To my astonishment, she drew up onto her hind legs. Her shoulders and chest had become relatively massive. She threw back her head and howled. The roar overcame even a tinnitus from the sound of the 12-gauge rounds. It was the same I'd heard from the woodline, the same as from the now dead fiend lying just inside my front door. And she slowly lowered her head and looked towards me. She wore a sinister grin that quickly turned to embarrassment. She looked down, clearly abashed, and then sprung through what was left of the front door on our home and ran into the darkness once again on all 4s. I was in too much shock to even shout after her. At that point, I wasn't sure that I wanted her to come back inside at all. And then the awful odour rose from the carcass in front of me. The creature seemed to melt. The features morphed and collapsed until there was a dead, naked woman stretched out before me. Her hair was long and stringy and dirty, and she was hairy from head to toe and filthy. A pile of putrid fur and flesh outlined her corpse. The mass looked like a large dog roadkill that had been run over several times and left to sit in the hot sun for a few days, and smelled like it too. I realized as I leaned forward and vomited onto the body, adding my own stink. How am I going to explain this? I asked myself as I awaited the deputies. After I'd recovered from the initial shock, I realized that I had a set of claw marks on my left arm and forearm. I set the shotgun aside. Definitely didn't want to have that in hand when the rural sheriff's deputies responded to a homicide. It went better, if more strangely, than I had anticipated. I met the deputies outside and pointed towards the dead woman thing. The foulness had driven me out into the fresh night air. I warned the 2 as they drew their sidearms and stalked into my house. They didn't pay attention and both quickly fled back out onto the porch. One of them leaned over the far rail to lose his supper. Sorry, dude. I did try to warn you, I thought uncharitably. Eventually, they recovered and cleared my home, and one took my statement while the other called in the ambulance crew and used his phone to call their boss. It was going to be another long night. The lead EMS employee looked at my scratches. She let the deputies take a few photos and then bandaged them. Around the gouges, the skin showed definite signs of irritation. "Sir, you can drive yourself or we can take you, but you really need to have an ER doc look at them." She glanced at the SO lieutenant to confirm that I would be free to seek treatment. He nodded and stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, Sheriff Scroggins and the Justice of Peace are on their way. Do you think you could wait until they officially clear the scene before you seek treatment?" I agreed. The paramedic looked at the lieutenant and then and then shrugged. "Your call, sir, but please, you really need to see someone soon. There will definitely be infection. In fact, I believe there already is. Don't see many that take hold so rapidly." The sheriff himself arrived within a few minutes with the Justice of Peace in tow. There was no county coroner or medical examiner in this rural corner of the county. The JP would be there to make a death ruling. Pretty easy. In the time since the deputies arrived, more than the flesh had fallen off the woman's body. No one could or would go near the reeking mass any more than necessary. But when the sheriff and JP viewed the pictures that the first arriving units had taken, they both looked shocked. They looked at each other in silent communication, and then at me. And Sheriff Cloud spoke first. "Mr. Brooks, just how did you know the lady in question?" I peered at him, a little puzzled. "Know her? The first time I saw her, she was hiding out in the woods, wearing some kind of, costume, like a werewolf. Next time, she burst through my front door and raked me with her talons." He grunted slightly. "Was there anyone else here? Anyone who may corroborate with your story?" I shrugged. "Just my dog, Lacy, but she ran off into the trees, likely in fear of the shotgun rounds. She bit that woman, dragged her from where she fell," I added hesitantly. "Look, this is clearly a homicide." He quickly raised his hands. "Not a murder. Homicide just means that one person killed another. The means and motive provide the category of the homicide and determine whether there was a crime. She clearly burst through your door, and your wounds are obviously defensive from an investigative standpoint, that is. The DA will have to corroborate at this time, but it's my call that this was self-defense and we won't be seeking any criminal charges." He paused and took a breath. "Are you familiar with, or have you heard the name Lacy Albert?" I stared at the name and quickly explained. "Lacy is my dog's name. I picked her up at the shelter, up in town. About a month ago. I don't recall hearing the name Albert at all. Wait, I think there's a local family by that name, or maybe I read it in the local... Yeah, that's it. There was a story on a hometown news site. Something about her missing, or... No, you were looking for her. She was wanted. Some kind of assault or a murder? You mean that's her? That's the same woman?" The pair of public officials paused and then in unison, like a pair of bauble-headed dolls, nodded. The JP took a turn. "We believe that Lacy may have been responsible for killing her parents and boyfriend and possibly some others. We have we have some evidence to that effect, though we're not really at liberty to discuss this at this time. From your standpoint, I think it's safe to say that you are unlikely to face charges. We still have to complete an investigation, and of course, the DA's office will have to complete the review." I barely heard the rest in my rush of relief. It was indeed a long night, and the sun was up before the final first responders left my property. They'd already processed the scene, and just as the first rays of sun broke the horizon, they carted off the now putrid mass of gunk and bones. The stench was reduced a little. The crime scene team had applied some solutions to the affected areas to prevent contamination. That odd, rapid deterioration made it clear that there was something different about this case. I really wanted a shower and a nap before I drove to the ER. I thought that maybe I could get an appointment with my regular doc instead. And then I saw her, my pup, my Lacy, hobbled tiredly from the tree line and towards the house. We both would need a bath. She was filthy, but she looked like her old self, and she perked up a little and gave me a goofy smile as she trotted to my side. She reeked. I was too tired to make her a bath, and so I coaxed her over to the garden hose and washed off most of the gunk. As I rubbed her as clean as I could without shampoo, I noted that she had developed some serious musculature, and I was sure that she had grown. Odd crap happening with my dog, I thought worriedly. Once the major chunks were left behind in the yard and Lacy had a good shake, we went into the house and I took a shower. She was clingy, so I let her join me in the walk-in enclosure and we both scrubbed with shampoo. I knew she would make a mess when she got out and shook, but I didn't want her on the furniture or carpet until the dirt and stink were gone. As I bent down to scrub her, she turned and spewed her dragon breath into my face. So much for the too expensive cleaning. Once we were both clean and as dry as could be, I called my doc and got the last appointment of the day at 2 p.m. I set the alarm on my phone and then literally crashed into my bed. My last thought was that I would need to rent a carpet cleaner. Scratch that. I need to get rid of the rug by the front door. Oh, wait. The crime scene techs had taken it for evidence. My last sensation was Lacy snuggling beside me. She felt warmer than usual, almost like she had a fever. I was running through the forest. My breath was ragged and I was panting. My tongue lolled out the side of my mouth and drool dripped onto the pine straw below. I looked downward and saw paws. I had paws. And then I smelled something. Normally, I would have gagged at the odour, but it now smelled intriguing, even enticing. I ran towards the delectable smell, the smell of blood, the smell of food. I burst through the stand of brush and into a small clearing by a cattle pond. I recognized it. Lacy and I had found it not far into the woods and near an abandoned property next to ours. The carcass of some unfortunate animal lay on the edge of the clearing next to the water. A pair of turkey vultures gnawed at some delectable pieces but fled when I appeared, all the while ensuing a deep growl from the depths of my throat. I stalked over to the pond and checked my reflection in the still water to see what I already knew to be. As I lowered my head over the water, I saw pointed ears that swept back above my furry face. And then the alarm sounded. It was time to get up, get dressed, and go see Dr. Castillo. My wounds felt hot and swollen, but I figured it would be best to wait for the doctor to remove the bandages. I didn't check, but I was sure I had a fever. As I passed through the front entrance of my house, no door left. I had to stop and lean over the rail and gag a dry heave for a moment from the rancid stench of the death and rot, masked only slightly by the chemical odour. Lacy had accompanied me onto the porch. Not like I could stop her, but I didn't think my doc would like her to go inside, and I didn't want to leave her in the truck. So I convinced her to go back inside and wait. It's okay, girl. Just going on to the next town over. Big city in this part of the world. After I see old grouchy Roberto, I'm sure I'll have to go by the pharmacy. I'll get you some of the treats you like. She listened to me intently, as though she genuinely understood the words I spoke, not in the silly way that dogs sometimes seem to understand. She actually grinned and nodded. And then she turned on her heels and walked back inside the house. Apparently, the foul odour near the front entrance didn't bother her as she planted her behind on the floor where the rug and her body had rested. She struck up the doggy seated at the door waiting patiently pose and drawled onto the floor a little. I left what was left of the front door ajar. I thought of hanging a sheet of some plastic over it, but 1, I wanted the air to circulate and remove more of the stink, and 2, I felt awful. I didn't feel like driving the nearly 40 miles to see my doctor, much less making home repairs, but it was clearly becoming critical. I managed to make it to not only the doctor's office, but inside. I'd only seen Dr. Castillo twice before, and so we were still new to each other. Still, he took one look and asked, "Why didn't you just go to the emergency room? I'm happy to take care of you, but this should not have waited." "Doc, I was exhausted and sleepy, like I've rarely ever been. That crazy woman who attacked me, I'm sure she had plenty of unsavory substances beneath her nails. As it is, I barely made it to your office." He nodded. "Yep, typical hard-headed old man, much like me. He chuckled a little. You know, you have a higher fever than should be the case with such a recent infection. And yes, the wounds are infected. We will need to... A roaring noise supplanted his voice in my ears, and my vision shrank into a long grey tunnel and then into the dark cave of unconsciousness. Well, eventually, I either had to die or regain my senses. Apparently, I'd accomplished the latter when my eyes fluttered open, and after a moment of gummy blur, I made out the face of a nurse in the bland, basic tones of a hospital room. So, how are we feeling now, Mr. Brooks? Any better? I know, I must have looked confused. Could she not tell that I was confused? What was wrong with her? She's been intelligent enough to pass the RM program, but why am I so angry? I wondered. Not like me to be angry at anyone for no real reason. Apparently, she took my stupid, grouchy look to mean that I had no clue, which I didn't. Sir, you lost consciousness in Dr. Castillo's office. He brought you over here to the emergency room, and that was a few hours ago. You have infected wounds and a fever. Is there anyone you'd like us to call for you? My throat was dry as the Mojave, but I managed to croak out, No, I live alone. Oh, wait, my dog, Lacy. Not sure whom to call. I realized I was in one of those awful hospital gowns. Where's my phone? For that matter, where's my pants? We eventually sorted out my belongings and clothing. Dr. Castillo had admitted me for an overnight stay for observation. Dr. Stone, meanwhile, had decided that she'd take a house call, collect Lacy, and keep her at the clinic overnight. She'd also contact the sheriff's office and get them to check out on the house overnight. What a sweet lady, I thought as I clicked off my phone. She texted me back before long and then told me that she had been unable to locate Lacy. She had looked and called out but could not find her, and so she set out some food and water and would wait another hour. I sent back that, in addition to paying her fee, that I'd like to take her out for dinner when I was back on my feet. I was surprised when she quickly responded that she'd like that. Lacy didn't show and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. No dreams this time. I was cleared to go home late the next morning. My fever had dissipated and my welts looked to become an impressive set of scars about which I could tell lies. Brag. I was still weak but felt up to driving. I was worried about Lacy and couldn't believe that I'd asked Dr. Stone on a date. Well, I equavated internally, just dinner. I stopped at the pharmacy for my new prescription from Cipro and some pain meds that I tried to avoid taking. I kept my promise and picked up a box of Lacy's favourite treats. Hopefully she had returned, likely just out exploring. I drove up towards the side of the house and there she was, sitting on the front porch, tail pounding, all fear from the past days apparently wiped from her short memory. She looked different. Her fuzzy puppy hair had straightened and she was apparently grown more. She definitely bulked up. The muscle definition along her front legs and her thighs and her back legs stood out clearly. She bounded towards me and, as weak as I felt, I feared that she might topple me, but she slowed at the last moment and reared up onto her hind legs. She threw her front legs and paws around me and gave me an all-too-human hug. My dog had definitely become a stranger. Later that day, we played on the sofa and watched TV, not something we did too often. Not much worth watching, just dreck and drivel. Again with the grouchy, or nearly angry thoughts. I still felt awful and before I knew it, I awoke to late afternoon sun pouring through one of the living room windows. Guest TV was even more boring than usual, I thought as I blinked away the drowsiness. Oh, right, I mused. I took one of the prescription pain pills before I arrived home. The odour of something savoury wafted in from the dining area. I creaked and groaned my way to my feet. Nothing unusual, something always hurt these days. The mutant effect of the pain medicine had worn off and I was hurting enough that I feared that I would not die. Internal laugh. I got that one from Rhonda. There was a freshly heated microwave dinner on the table. Weird. I didn't recall getting up and making that. I looked over towards the front. entrance. Couldn't really call it a door, since there wasn't one. Yet there was a nice sheet of heavy plastic over the damaged portal. The very piece from the garage I'd had in mind. I definitely didn't remember getting up to do that. I considered the possibilities. 1. I was on more or better drugs than I realized. 2. I'd snapped. 3. A good Samaritan had come in and set up everything while I rested. Maybe Dr. Stone. Or 4. The good folk, the Fae, had come up at last and put up my door and made me a meal for me. And now I'd have to put out milk and treats for them. I went with number 1 for the time being. I must have been semi-lucid. Maybe I'd taken another pill. No idea, but I was hungry. The infection had left me nauseous until I fell asleep on the couch. Now I was ravenous. I quickly devoured the meatball and pasta dinner, cleaned up, and then more closely inspected the temporary repair work on the front door. Yep, I realized it. It had definitely been number 1. It was clearly the work of an intoxicated person. I guessed that and didn't rule out number 2. Still, it was weird. I'd never had a lost time episode. Good dope. I heard a rush of feet coming down the stairs, and Lacy had run up while I consumed supper. I looked over to the table, and there she stood. Stood? Well, her front paws were splayed on the tabletop. Just a doggy lean. Those painkillers. Odd that she had taken to standing on her hind legs so much. She had been good about jumping on me only during play. And then today there was the hug, and now this. Dang. Her front paws had gotten huge. Nails definitely needed trimming. Lacy, you know better. Off the table. She looked at me, confused, and then a little annoyed, before she dropped backwards onto her haunches and stared at me expectantly. "Thank you, dear lady," I said and gave her a little bow. She gave me a radiant pooch smile. My reverie over the mysteries of my meal and the door repairs was short-lived. I took my evening dose and went up to bed. I heard Lacy trundle up behind me, but I didn't look at her. It was what I expected her to do, what she always did. At the top of the stairs, I felt the blood rush to my head and I became suddenly dizzy. I snatched at the stair rail and I tumbled backwards, and then my fall was arrested and I was gently pushed back to my feet. I stumbled onto the top landing and looked back to see Lacy on her hind legs again, now wearing a look of concern. She caught me and set me on my feet. I thought in astonishment and almost experienced another head rush. "What is up with you, silly dog?" I murmured as I turned and shuffled down the hallway to my room. After a moment, I heard her feet padding along behind me. I awakened in a more lucid and energetic mood. Lacy gave me a quick sniff check and then trotted into the hallway, on all fours. I must have been imagining things last night. Definitely some fine prescription dope. She likely had to go and she would definitely be hungry, I realized. As I finished cooking breakfast and placed it onto the table, I heard my phone give a text notification. It was Dr. Stone. "Lacy back yet?" I confirmed that she was and that we'd been hanging around the house while I recuperated. She wished me well and I wished her a good day at the office. When I finished typing, I looked up and there was Lacy, seated in the chair at the other end of the table, grinning almost like normal, but she leaned back onto her haunches, her elbows bent upwards and tucked at her sides, her paws and claws drooping. There was something sinister about the way she looked at me. The grin was wicked and somehow familiar. Her ears had begun to point more, almost like they were cropped, and had they grown closer towards the crown of her head? She sat tall in the seat. Tall, not long. WTF, I thought in text language. I'd never thought or spoke in text language, but this had become a freak show. That does it. We're going back to see Dr. Stone, young lady. She just widened that awful grin and huffed a little. Not quite a bark, but not quite a laugh. Yet, no sooner did we get through the side door by the truck than she froze. Much like the night she'd been attacked, she stared into the trees for a moment, and then dashed out into the shadows of the morning, once more on all fours but running with an odd gait, as though her front legs had grown faster than the rear. I called after her in vain, and after a while I decided to just go into town and see the good doctor without the dog. Maybe a good idea. Not sure what the other patients' owners would think of her behaviour. I wasn't that familiar with the locals. I'd only been up on the weekends until late last year when I pulled the trigger on retirement. I clambered in behind the wheel of my pickup and reached over to the handle to close the door. That's when I heard the ear-splitting howl, higher pitched than the ones from the werewoman wolf, younger somehow, like those of an early adolescent compared to a grown person. Oh, Lacy, what have we gotten into? The next few months went by in a blur. The DA had declined charges, and there was only a brief mention in the news that Lacy Elbert had been found deceased. And there was oddly very little said about it. In a small town, rumours get around, but everyone had gone silent on the subject. At least I was off the hook. Our home had a new front door, but the faint odour of death still lingered, at least to my senses. Miriam, Dr. Stone to you, said it was just my imagination. The dinner date had gone well. As for Lacy, she grew, not only in stature but in strangeness. She spent most of her time roaming a vast timberland nearby, yet she came back to visit occasionally. We knew it was her despite the changes to her appearance. Miriam helped me with some online research. Lacy had become a dogman or dogwoman. Many of those creatures were known to look ferocious but still avoid harming people. Lacy was like that, and we surmised that if a werewolf, a human who morphed at least partway into a wolf, part of the family Canis because it was infected, then perhaps a dog, already a member of Canis, would morph partway into a human under the same circumstances. Perhaps one capable of making a microwave dinner and completing a temporary repair. Nah, option one it was and well, had to be. Miriam and I sat out on the front porch, drinking iced tea and relaxing in the evening shadows. I had just finished crooning that old standard, By the Light of the Silvery Moon. She'd just have to get used to that, though she didn't seem to mind too much. In fact, she wiggled a little closer. From the near distance, a deep-throated howl sounded. A hunting howl. Shortly from within the tree line, we saw a pair of red, glowing eyes, about 6 feet off the ground. The silhouette of a canid with sharp ears at the top of its, her, head appeared, and then the lean, muscular figure emerged into the waning light and stalked towards the Porsche, reddish-blonde fur gleaming. The sweet Lacy approached, her tail wagging, and that sinister yet friendly smile spread across her features as she approached us. And she had become a large and fearsome being. Yet she dropped to all fours and gave us each a doggy kiss. Oh, that breath. Wow. Absolutely awesome, as it always is, with the wonderful Michael Lockhart. As ever, guys, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build our channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR. If you want to support the show further, or possibly just treat yourself to something special, you can hit up my Teespring store for merchandise. Or of course there is the PayPal donation link in the description box of each video. Your support and kind words are more than enough though, guys. A big thank you as always for everything you do. The shares, the likes, the messages and emails. It really goes a long way. And as ever, guys, remember, above all, be safe, not sorry.